Happy Monday! I've been hard at work on another full-blown tutorial, but while I was in the middle of it, I happened to be looking back through my notation and I spied right in the middle of everything else this teeny little idea. And it sounded like this. And that was it. That was the entire idea. For some reason, I decided to just write that down in the middle of everything else. And in today's Make It Up on a Monday, we're going to take that tiny little idea and turn it into an entire tune. Make it up on a Monday. All right, in just a second, we're going to take a listen to the end. We're going to skip to the end and listen to how it all turned out before we do the big, long analysis of how we built it up. But I did want to call out before we get there that there's quite a bit of theory in today's little talk. Many of you ask me, I want to be able to sit down and just make up music. I want to either improvise or write tunes on my own. And there's a lot of that in today's after party, for lack of a better term. So some of the things we may be covering here, a lot of theory. We're going to talk about resolution. Why does one chord want to go to another chord? We're also going to be talking about the 2-5-1 progression and how it's a little bit of a silver bullet. It's kind of magical. Has to do with resolution. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about modes and how different scales contribute to a certain feeling. We may even spend some time talking about various scales that are handy for creating a certain sound. But before all that, let's just skip to the end and take a listen to how it all turned out. Okay, so we're starting off with that germ of an idea. Clearly, the only reason I took time to write this down is I kind of like the chords. We've got this F minor ninth chord. Let's talk about why that is. It's the F in the bass. An E flat is the seventh of an F chord. The G is the ninth. E flat is the minor third. That's what makes this a minor chord versus something else. And the C is the fifth. Now, when it comes to harmony, the fifth doesn't contribute very much. This and this aren't very different. You can't really tell what's the quality of that. But the second you add that, as opposed to this, that's where you start to define the harmony. And since we've got this seventh and a ninth right next to this minor third, creating that cool dissonance, and then the fifth to just kind of fill it out, it's just kind of a nice voicing for an F minor tonality. Now, it moves up to this G minor chord. It's kind of a G minor 11th, I would call this. We've got G, the seventh, once again. This B flat is the minor third. That makes it have that minor sound. But notice between the first chord and the second chord, this top C stays in place. It doesn't move. And this is one of my favorite things. It's a very primitive version of something called voice leading, where the way you place notes within a chord and the way it creates whether things stay static or move is like a little bit of inner melody. And the fact that we're leaving this C right here is cool. I like the way that that just sits there. We could have done this, but it moves in a different way, right? So leaving it there creates a suspension, first of all. So this is, you could call that an F sus4 chord, but when you put it over G, I would probably start calling this a G minor 7th with an 11th in it. Okay, so we go from F minor 9th up to that 11th, then, now just like what we said before, this C is still there. So we've got this, the C's there, up to that, the C's still there, back down to here, and then the C is in every chord, which is, it's like this bell tone that's sitting there all the time. Now this next chord that we just talked about, it's an interesting voicing because in the right hand we've got what's called a quartal voicing, which means that the intervals are all a fourth from each other. D up to G and G up to C. And that by itself is an interesting thing because it's open and it doesn't really tell you exactly what chord it is. This could be some kind of D minor maybe, some kind of C major, an F. I mean, depending on what you add to the bass, these chordal voicings are very flexible. We're adding an E in the bass, which gives this a C major quality. If we take the C from the top and drop it down to here, and then take the E from the bass and move it up to here, now we've got what feels like a big C major triad with an added ninth. So, C major with a ninth added is the way I would describe that chord. So once again, F minor, G minor 7 with an 11th, F minor 9th, down to that C major with an added ninth. Now I really like these chords. I like the open sound of them. This one's open, this one's got this nice tight dense dissonance right there. I really love the way this stays the same in every chord. Now, that's cool, right? But it only takes us so far, right? There's not a lot there yet. So let's think about where we could go next. And one of my favorite things to do when I'm writing is to try to listen, where do things want to go? And this is where we're going to get into chord resolution a little bit. We're going to go a little bit deeper in this in a second, but let's just think about this. With that C and the way we've kind of kept things, that everything except the C is moving somewhat together. For example, if we leave out the G, the two other notes that are moving here go. And so there's a way that this might want to move, which is to just continue on down. Let's experiment with that. That's pretty nice. That feels pretty comfortable to me. It feels like this wants to go here. And the reason for that is because of this continuing chromatic motion that happens between these chords. It's one of the ways that chords have a tendency to create a feeling like they want to get someplace. We've done this to here. That's pretty natural to go there next, okay? And then if we just repeat the same thing down a whole step, we can actually keep this going. Right? And then it just goes all the way down. Now here's an interesting thing. We've walked all the way down here. Let's start at A, down to G. Something magical happens right here. Because we're back at the chord where we started, we ended up here, it settles a little bit. We remember, the human mind remembers where we were, the key that we were in, and when we get back there, there's this little feeling of, I'm home, right? So I love that. That's one of my favorite things. When we walk down, I like the way this goes from A to G, and then back to F. I really like that feeling, and I want to actually put that in the tune somehow. So some of those movements are what we want to include. The problem is, how can I get from F minor to A minor? They're pretty disjointed. They don't feel like it naturally goes from here to there. So let's take a little time out and talk about another way that chords have a tendency to want to resolve. Okay, so we're going to talk about C major for just a second because it's all white keys. If we're in the key of C, just playing a C major scale, the C chord, C major chord, C, E, and G, there's a chord that is a natural resolution to that chord, and it's called the dominant seventh. If I'm in the key of C major, the dominant seventh of that is G dominant seventh. Right there. So this has a tendency to want to go there, doesn't it? Doesn't that just feel nice and comfortable? Hokey, but comfortable, right? Okay, so why? Why does this feel so natural to go there? Let's look at the intervals in that C major scale. There's a combination of whole steps and half steps. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step. There's two places where we have half steps, between the E and the F and the B and the C. The G dominant seventh chord, there are three notes that define a chord as a G dominant seventh. The G, to let you know that that's the chord, you must have the third to dictate that it's a major chord of some sort, and then you must have that dominant seventh. So really, the key notes are G, B, and F. Now if we leave out the G for a second and just talk about the third and the seventh, they want to go here. And you'll notice when we talked about those half steps, from E to F and from B to C, These are the half-step intervals in the scale. The G7 is here, and the C is there. Isn't that great? So those half steps want to resolve. That B wants to go there. The F wants to go there. You put those together, incredibly strong power for wanting to resolve that way. Those resolutions from 5 to 1 make natural things happen with respect to music. If we back up, way back, I'm trying to figure out how to get from F minor to A minor, okay? And there's this great chord progression, heavily used in jazz, but also used anywhere else that it works, called a 2-5-1 progression. If we're back in C, because it's all white keys, if I go up to the 2 chord in C major, it becomes a D minor chord. That's the 2. Now let's do that 5, which is the G7 we just talked about, and then back to 1. That is the 2-5-1 progression. In jazz, it's usually some kind of D minor 7th chord, some kind of dominant 7th chord on the 5, and then the 1 chord. Now, let's spice that up a little bit because, you know, really, that's terrible by itself. So we got to add a little bit of flavor to this. Okay, so the D, when we go to that 7 chord, it's really common to do some kind of altered 7th chord. So instead of just plain old G7, the common altered tones are the flat 9, the sharp 9, the flat 5, and the sharp 5. Okay, all of those make cool, more interesting 5 chords to resolve to that 1. As we get into the jazz idea of this, now, we've talked about the way 2-5-1s resolve a little bit. I want to show you something kind of cool here. If we think about, we're in C, let's go to the 6, let's go to the 2, let's go to the 5, let's go to the 3. Why go to the 3? Because the 3 resolves down a 5th to the 6. 6 resolves down a 5th to the D. D resolves down a 5th to the 5, which resolves down to the 1. Circle of 5ths happening over and over again. If you play this as a chord progression, you get this. 3, 6, 2, 5. 1, 6, 2, 5. 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Isn't that cool? The way that just works. It's all circle of 5ths, those dominant 7th chords resolving down a 5th to the next one. Super fun. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about resolution of chords and the 2-5-1 facet of that. Keep that in mind because here's our trick. We're trying to get from F somehow we want to get up to A minor. So here's one way we could do it, a very simple way. When we go to this C chord, right? Remember we've talked about this as being a C major with an added 9th. It's got an E in the bass. Well, we're trying to get to A minor. What's up a 5th from A? E. Isn't that cool? So if that were a dominant 7th chord, would it naturally want to resolve to A minor, which is where we're trying to get? Let's try it. right? I used a E7 chord with a flat 9 to make it a little bit interesting. Let's try it again with some different variations. That's pretty natural. I think we can even do better though, because if we add the 2 to make it a 2-5-1, all of a sudden now it's gonna create several chords that lead us to our desired A chord. So we're here in F, our progression. How about right here? Let's go to the 2 of that 2-5-1. We're doing a 2-5-1 towards A minor. So the 5 of that is E7, just like we talked about. And the 2 of that is going to be B minor. Okay? Got it? Now that we know the 2 and the 5 and the 1, let's make it a little bit more interesting. In that 2 chord, let's make it a little bit of what's called a half diminished chord. It's got a regular dominant 7th, a minor 3rd, but then the normal 5th, we're going to flat that to make a half diminished chord. And then the E7, that's E with a sharp 5 and a sharp 9. Okay, let's put it together with the whole thing. Right here. Ooh, I love that, right? It just naturally feels. There's one kind of surprising thing when we went to the F, up to this G minor, and then we walk up to B. That's a little unexpected. But from there, it's all feeling good. And this is why the 2-5-1 is such a magical silver bullet. If you want to get to some chord, if you throw a 2-5-1 in before that chord, it almost always works, right? Let's just pick a random chord here. Let's say I want to get to A flat, right? I want to get to there from there. The 2-5-1 of A flat is going to be B flat to E flat 7. So as long as we play our chords, and then we do the 2-5-1 before A flat, I think we can get from F minor to this weird A flat minor modulation in a fairly natural way. Let's try it. 2-5-1. Sounds totally normal, right? I love that. That's so cool. Okay, so 2-5-1s, learn them, master them. If you're writing or you're trying to figure out the way to play and get from one key to another, 2-5-1s are the way to get from one chord to another one. Okay, so now, why were we even doing this? Why were we trying to get to A minor? Because at the beginning, we loved this idea of walking down so that we can have that nice settling back to the tonic. Let's try that little whole progression just to see how it feels. So we've got F starting off kind of at the beginning here. Going down. Isn't that fun? I love the way that just naturally rolls through. Now, my hang up is too short. It goes through the whole progression like that. Let's stretch this out a little bit. Let's go back to the F. Okay. Instead of going right to here, let's add something like a dominant 7th. then go there. Okay, so let's take it up an octave so it's a little easier to hear. Little B flat, and this is just a dominant 7th, but I'm adding in a voicing that has the 13th right next to that 7th and the 9th, which I kind of like. So, got it? Now we'll go down to the C. I missed it. Here we go. Let's keep it going. Dominant 7th. Walking down now here. Up to the 7th. And when I say 7th, I'm wrong. We're walking up to the 4 chord. When I was in that F minor, we're walking from what we had at the very beginning. We're walking up to the 4 chord, a dominant 7th on B flat if we're in the key of F. And all we're going to do is when we do that 2-5-1 and we go to A, we're just going to do the exact same progression but walk it down. So from the 2-5-1, the 4 chord, here's the walk down, that resolves naturally to G, up to the 4 chord, which is the C, and this wants to go back to our tonic. Now, I'm liking this a lot. I really like the chord progression. And it's a little complicated, and it's got enough length to feel like a progression at this point. But there's some weirdness here, because you'll notice that when we go up, we're going to the 4 chord here, back up, and then we go, remember, that kind of wants to go down, okay? But it's technically a C chord, and we've talked all about the resolution of chords. If we're playing a C dominant 7th, it wants to go to F, which is where we're trying to go, because we're not going to want to go down this time. We want that to feel more like it's going back to F instead of E flat. And so let's add a little lick here that makes this feel more C-like. And why that lick? We've got the C, the E to show that it's a minor or a major chord, the dominant 7th, and a sharp 5. It's just kind of a cool lick that uses an altered tone. It's that chord in a lick. Okay? So now it's starting to feel a little bit more like a tune. There's beginning to be hints of melody snippets in here. We go down here. I like that. And we can play that, we can use that each time we're doing this chord progression. Now, I think we're starting to have the beginnings of something here. Let's get a little bit of the feel. So when I was playing around with this a little bit, the original groove I had in mind was kind of a slow that kind of a feel. Let's change the rhythm slightly. And I like that anticipation. Okay, with the chord progression kind of worked out and we explained how we got there, let's talk about the melody a little bit. You've already heard the tune, so you know what the melody sounds like. The melody works because we're in a specific mode. F, if we look at that chord, that F minor ninth chord, let's revoice that a little bit. That's an F minor ninth as well. F, A flat, C, E flat, and G. We could keep those extensions going and add the 11th and the 13th. Drop the extensions, which are these three, down an octave. And what we end up is this particular scale. That's a Dorian scale, or the Dorian mode. Modes, just briefly, and if you want more information on this, leave a comment and we'll talk more about this, but modes are different tonalities that come from using a particular set of pitches. If we're in C and use the white keys to play a major scale, that is called the Ionian mode. And Ionian is that major tonality sound. It's got a major third, whole steps. We go up a half step to the fourth, up to the fifth, up to the sixth, a major seventh, and then a half step to get back to the one. Ionian mode. Now if we just start our scale on D, still using all white keys, it's got a very different feel, doesn't it? It's kind of mysterious, it's minor, so it's a little bit, I don't know if sad is the right word, but a little haunting. You know, if you that sounds really different from, that's Ionian, and this is Dorian, okay? And each one of those scales, if you start on E, that's Phrygian mode. F to F is Lydian and has this great. G to G is called Mixolydian. That is the defining note there. A to A is very similar to Dorian. Dorian, remember, is a minor sounding scale. A minor, this is Aeolian mode, is also very minor, but the sixth interval, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, is only a half a step. That's the difference between Aeolian and Dorian. Okay? It's a subtle thing. And then you've got this last one, which goes B to B. This is called Locrian mode. It's very, it starts off with a half step. Very kind of exotic sounding. Anyways, modes are an interesting way to sort of choose a tonality or a type of mood or sound based on a particular scale. And because we're using those particular notes in our chords, we're kind of in a Dorian modality. So our melody that we already wrote comes from using those Dorian. Even though we're not using the six. That's what it would be like it. And as we solo over this, we're going to stick to those Dorian tones for the most part. Now, structure-wise, you've already heard the tune, but what we decided to do, initially when I wrote this, I had this feel of a halftime feel. And when I say halftime, what we're really talking about is the way the snare accents happen. So if I'm counting like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, I could choose to put the snare on beats 2 and 4, which is the standard place for what's called a backbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. standard, every beat you've ever heard that's in the sort of rock, funk, groove thing has what's called a backbeat, where the snare typically hits on 2 and 4. A halftime groove delays that at half speed. So if you're counting the same 4, the snare hits on 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's what we were kind of shooting for at the beginning of this. And to structure this, you've already heard it, but what we wanted to do is take 3 times through the chord progression, and the first time through is the melody at half tempo, like half-time backbeat. The middle time through the progression is normal backbeat, 2 and 4, and we're going to solo for that one. And then the last time through goes back to the melody, double time. So it just ratchets up the energy. We let the bass go kind of crazy, rolling over this sort of heavy backbeat that's that sort of a thing. And it just gives us an energy shape to the song that keeps it a little bit interesting. Instead of just playing that half tempo all the way throughout, we're going to start really slow, lots of space. We're going to take it up a little bit in the solo, play some solos, have the beat a little bit more traditional, but moving along more than that halftime section. And then when we drop in for the third time through, it just froths with a ridiculously high level of energy, which is kind of our goal. And then we just end right there at the end of that big frothing section. Okay, so in our melody, there's one little thing that's a little bit interesting, that's a theory thing that we can touch on very quickly. We've got that 2-5-1. To get from B minor of some sort to E dominant 7th to A minor. And in our melody, we're going to do something kind of weird here. We're going to assume that we're already thinking in E dominant 7th. And in jazz, it's really common to use those altered tones. In fact, it's so common that there's a scale dedicated to them. Okay? So if we're playing E7, the standard alterations to that in the jazz world are the flat 9th, the sharp 9, the flat 5, and the sharp 5. And so if we look at those pitches, here's our E dominant 7th scale. The altered tones are flat 9, sharp 9. Let's go ahead and use the 3rd, because that's important to call this a dominant 7th chord. Let's go to flat 5, sharp 5, dominant 7th, and then we're back up to E. So if we have an E scale that contains the E, the major 3rd, and the dominant 7th, and then every other note is those altered tones, it's called the altered scale. Inventive name, right? It has other names, but and it's a really kind of a cool little set of notes to work with if you're trying to get through a 2-5-1, because it just has this kind of cool outside feel, because you're playing all those altered tones while still including the 3rd and the dominant 7th, which define the tonality of the chord itself. It's a handy little trick. So, right? That was a long one. If you're still here, thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you found that interesting. We've just barely skimmed the surface of a ton of different really interesting topics related to music theory, resolution of chords, the way chords want to move towards a particular destination, the 2-5-1 progression being a good example of that that's heavily used. some modes. We talked about the altered scale a little bit and ways you can use that to create an interesting solo pattern. But we barely touched on any of them in any depth. If you want more information on any of those topics, leave me a comment, and maybe we can do a little bit more of a deep dive on one of those things if I didn't cover it in depth enough in this ridiculously long video. And with that, thanks for tuning in. I hope to see you next time. Okay, that's a ton of information. I have no clue how in the hell I'm gonna edit this down to anything less than an hour-long video. But we'll do our best.